The classified ad had been running for months. $80,000 per year. Private driver needed. No questions asked. Nobody wanted the job. But one rainy morning, Samuel Carter, drowning in debt and grief, dialed the number. Minutes later, he stood before the Whitmore mansion, its silent windows staring back like witnesses. The butler whispered, "She's been waiting for you." When Samuel stepped inside, he felt it instantly, an invisible grief clinging to every wall. Did he really know what he was about to walk into? Samuel Carter had stopped believing in fresh starts 3 years ago. That was when Laura died in their bedroom while he held her hand, whispering promises he knew he couldn't keep. The cancer had taken her quickly, and the medical bills had taken everything else. What remained was a one-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper, a daughter who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 2 years, and a stack of overdue notices that grew taller every month. Grace was 7 now. She had Laura's dark hair and quiet eyes, but none of her mother's warmth. At school, teachers called her withdrawn. At home, she sat by the window and drew pictures of empty houses. Samuel tried everything. Therapy they couldn't afford, gentle questions she wouldn't answer, toys she ignored. Nothing worked. The silence between them had become its own language, one Samuel didn't know how to translate. The ad appeared in the back of the newspaper on a Tuesday morning. Samuel almost missed it, buried between listings for warehouse workers and security guards. $80,000 per year, private driver needed. No questions asked. He read it 3 times, certain it was a mistake or a scam. Nobody paid that much for a driver. Nobody. But desperation had a way of making impossibilities seem reasonable. Samuel called the number from a payphone outside the grocery store. A man answered on the first ring, his voice clipped and formal. "Whitmore residence?" Samuel cleared his throat. "I'm calling about the driver position." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then the man said, "Can you be here in an hour?" "I don't even know where." 42 Rosewood Hill, North Side, the Black Gate. The line went dead. Samuel stood there holding the receiver, rain beginning to tap against the glass. 42 Rosewood Hill. He knew the neighborhood by reputation only. Old money. Mansions hidden behind iron gates and hedges tall enough to block out the world. People who lived there didn't advertise for help in newspapers. They used agencies, connections, referrals from other wealthy families. But Samuel was out of options. The rent was 3 weeks overdue. Grace needed new shoes. The electricity had been threatened twice. He hung up the phone and walked back to the apartment, where Grace sat coloring at the kitchen table. She didn't look up when he entered. "I have to go somewhere," Samuel said softly. "Mrs. Chen from downstairs will watch you for a bit." Grace's crayon stopped moving. She stared at the paper, but didn't respond. Samuel knelt beside her chair. "I'll be back soon, I promise." She resumed coloring as if he hadn't spoken. The drive to Rosewood Hill took 20 minutes in his rusted sedan. The rain grew heavier, turning the streets into rivers of gray. When he reached the address, Samuel almost turned back. The mansion rose behind a black iron gate, like something from another century. 3 stories of stone and dark windows. Ivy crawled up the walls. The lawn stretched wide and empty, perfectly maintained, but lifeless. Samuel pressed the intercom button. The gate buzzed open without a word. He parked in the circular driveway and stepped out into the rain. Before he reached the front door, it opened. An elderly man stood in the doorway, dressed in a black suit that looked older than Samuel. His face was lined and weary, like someone who had witnessed too much and forgotten how to look away. "Mr. Carter," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I'm Arthur. Come in." The interior of the mansion was colder than the rain outside. High ceilings, dark wood floors, furniture that looked expensive and unused. Everything was perfectly arranged, but there was no warmth to it. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, just silence and space. Arthur led him down a long hallway. Their footsteps echoed. "The position is simple," Arthur said without turning around. "You drive Mrs. Whitmore to 4 locations every day. 8:30 in the morning. The route never changes. You wait. You drive her back. You don't ask questions." "That's it?" Samuel asked. "That's it. Why doesn't anyone want the job?" Arthur stopped walking. He turned to face Samuel, and for the first time, his expression softened into something like pity. "Because Mrs. Whitmore doesn't speak. She doesn't explain. And she goes to places that will break your heart if you let them." Before Samuel could ask what that meant, Arthur pushed open a door. The study was darker than the hallway. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. A woman sat behind a massive desk, her back straight, her hands folded on the surface. She was younger than Samuel expected, maybe 40, maybe less. Beautiful in a way that felt deliberate and cold. Her blonde hair was pulled back, her suit was black, her eyes were empty. Margaret Whitmore didn't stand when they entered. She studied Samuel the way someone might study a piece of furniture they were considering buying. "You have a daughter," she said finally. Her voice was flat, drained of inflection. Samuel blinked. "Yes." "How old?" "7." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked away, toward the darkened window. "You'll start tomorrow, 8:30. Arthur will show you the car." Thank you. I won't let you down." Margaret didn't respond. She had already dismissed him, her attention returning to papers on her desk that Samuel suspected she wasn't really reading. Arthur escorted him back through the hallway. At the door, the old man placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "A word of advice," Arthur said quietly. "Don't try to fix her. Don't try to understand. Just drive." Samuel wanted to ask more, but Arthur had already closed the door. The first morning, Samuel arrived 10 minutes early. The car was a black sedan, immaculate and silent. Margaret appeared at exactly 8:30, wearing the same expression she'd worn in the study, blank, distant, untouchable. She slid into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" Samuel asked. "The hospital." Samuel drove. Margaret stared out the window. When they reached the Children's Hospital on Clearwater Avenue, she didn't get out. She simply sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Samuel watched her in the rearview mirror. She didn't move, didn't cry, didn't do anything, just sat. After exactly 30 minutes, she said, "Next location." The second stop was a law office downtown. Margaret went inside for 15 minutes and came out with red-rimmed eyes and a harder expression. She didn't speak on the way to the third location. The third stop was the strangest. An empty lot on the edge of town, nothing there but a concrete foundation and weeds. Margaret stood beside the car and stared at it for 30 minutes. Samuel didn't understand. There was nothing to see, just broken ground and the ghost of something that was never built. The fourth stop was a bank. Margaret went inside. Samuel waited. When she returned, her face was a mask again. "Home," she said. They didn't speak the entire drive back. This became the routine. Every day. 4 stops, 30 minutes each. No explanations, no conversation. Just silence and grief so thick, Samuel could feel it pressing against the windows. Grace asked about the job once, in her own way. She drew a picture of a black car and left it on the kitchen table. Samuel stared at it for a long time, unsure what it meant. 2 weeks into the job, Grace got sick. A fever that spiked overnight and wouldn't break. Samuel called Arthur in a panic. "I can't leave her alone. I need to bring her with me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Arthur said, "Bring her." Samuel carried Grace to the car wrapped in a blanket. She was small and quiet, her face flushed with fever. Margaret was already in the back seat. When she saw Grace, something flickered across her face. Shock, maybe, or recognition. Her mouth opened slightly. Her hands tightened in her lap. Samuel placed Grace in the front passenger seat and started driving. In the rearview mirror, he saw Margaret staring at his daughter. Not with coldness, not with distance, with something raw and unguarded. At the hospital parking lot, Margaret didn't stare at the entrance. She stared at Grace. At the law office, she glanced back at the car twice. At the empty foundation, she stood closer to the vehicle than usual. At the bank, she returned faster. On the drive home, Margaret spoke for the first time in 2 weeks. "What's her name?" Samuel glanced in the mirror. Grace. Margaret's lips pressed together. She looked out the window, and Samuel thought he saw her hand move toward her face, toward tears she refused to let fall. When they arrived at the mansion, Margaret didn't get out immediately. She sat there, staring at the back of Grace's head. "Bring her tomorrow," Margaret said quietly, "if she's still sick." Samuel didn't know what to say. He nodded. Margaret stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. At the door, she stopped and turned back just for a moment. She looked at Grace again. And then she was gone. That night, Grace's fever broke. But something else had broken too. Something in the air between Samuel and the woman who hired him. A crack in the ice, small, barely visible. But there. Grace recovered, but Margaret's request lingered in Samuel's mind like an unanswered question. The next morning, he arrived alone. Margaret entered the car and said nothing about the empty front seat. But something had shifted. The silence between them felt different now, less like a wall and more like a held breath. The routine continued. Hospital parking lot, law office, empty foundation, bank. 30 minutes each. No explanations. But now Margaret occasionally glanced toward the front seat where Grace had been, as if checking whether the girl had reappeared. Samuel began to notice things he'd missed before. The way Margaret's hands trembled slightly when they pulled into the hospital lot. The way her breathing changed at the foundation site. Shallow, controlled, like someone trying not to drown. The way she always looked smaller when she returned from the law office, as if the building had taken something from her. He understood grief. He'd lived inside it for 3 years, knew its weight and texture, recognized it in the set of her shoulders, the careful blankness of her face. Margaret Whitmore was drowning in the same water that had nearly killed him. But understanding didn't mean speaking. Arthur's warning echoed every time Samuel thought about asking a question. Don't try to fix her, just drive. 3 weeks after Grace's fever, Samuel found Arthur in the mansion's kitchen. The old man was polishing silver that already gleamed, his movements slow and methodical. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said. Arthur didn't look up. "You can ask. The 4 places we go every day." "What are they?" Arthur set down the cloth. He looked at Samuel with those tired eyes that had seen too much. "The hospital is where her son was born. The law office is where she signed the papers to have him committed. The foundation is where she was building him a house before he died. And the bank is where she set up his trust fund that he never lived to use." The words landed like stones in water. Samuel felt them sink. How did he die? Overdose. 2 years ago. He was 23. Arthur picked up the cloth again, resumed polishing. The conversation was over. That night, Samuel held Grace while she slept. She'd fallen asleep on the couch watching cartoons, her small body curled against his side. He thought about Margaret sitting in that parking lot every morning, staring at the place where her son had entered the world. Thought about the foundation of a house that would never be built, about a mother signing papers to lock away her own child because addiction had made him a stranger. He thought about Laura in those final weeks, how she'd made him promise to take care of Grace, to make sure their daughter never forgot her, how impossible that promise had felt. Still felt. Samuel carried Grace to bed and tucked the blanket around her. She stirred slightly, made a small sound, but didn't wake. He stood there watching her breathe, this silent child who carried her own grief in ways he couldn't reach. Maybe Arthur was right. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed. Maybe all you could do was drive. But the next morning, when Margaret settled into the back seat and they pulled away from the mansion, Samuel found himself speaking anyway. "My wife died 3 years ago." The words came out before he could stop them. In the rearview mirror, Margaret's eyes lifted to meet his. "Cancer," Samuel continued. "Grace hasn't really talked since. Not to me. Not to anyone." Margaret looked away, back toward her window. Samuel thought he'd made a mistake, crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son's name was Michael." Samuel's hands tightened on the wheel. He waited, but Margaret said nothing more. They drove to the hospital in silence, but it was a different silence now. Not empty. Full. Over the following days, Margaret began to speak in small fragments. Never much. Never directly. But words appeared like cracks in ice, letting something through. At the law office, she said, "I put him in rehab 4 times. He hated me for it." At the foundation, she said, "He wanted to be an architect. I was building this for him, a place to start over." At the bank, she said, "I thought money could save him. I was wrong about everything." Samuel never responded with advice or comfort. He just listened. And slowly, Margaret's 30-minute vigils began to feel less like punishment and more like ritual, a way of keeping Michael alive, of refusing to let him become nothing. One afternoon, after they returned to the mansion, Margaret didn't immediately leave the car. She sat in the back seat, staring at her hands. "Do you ever feel like you failed them?" she asked. Samuel turned in his seat to face her. "Every day." Margaret's eyes were wet, but no tears fell. "I had all the resources in the world, the best doctors, the best facilities. And I still couldn't save him. What does that make me?" "Human," Samuel said. Margaret looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then she opened the car door and walked into the house without another word. That evening, Samuel received a text from an unknown number. It was Arthur. "She asked me to give you this. Bring Grace tomorrow if you'd like." Samuel stared at the message. Then he looked across the room, where Grace sat drawing another picture of an empty house. Something in his chest shifted. The next morning, Grace came with him. She sat in the front seat wrapped in her jacket, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit that had belonged to Laura. When Margaret entered the car, she saw Grace, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, yes, but also something like relief. They drove to the hospital. Margaret stared at the entrance, but her eyes kept drifting to Grace. After 15 minutes, she spoke. "What are you drawing?" Grace looked down at the notepad in her lap. She'd been sketching during the drive. She held it up without speaking. It was a picture of the car, the black sedan with 3 people inside. Margaret's breath caught. "It's beautiful." Grace lowered the paper and returned to her drawing, but Samuel saw it. The smallest smile at the corner of her daughter's mouth, the first he'd seen in months. At the law office, Margaret returned to the car faster than usual. She slid into her seat and looked at Grace. "I had a son," Margaret said quietly. "He liked to draw too. Houses, mostly. Buildings he wanted to design." Grace turned in her seat, looking back at Margaret for the first time. She didn't speak, but she listened. "He was sick," Margaret continued. "Not the kind of sick that doctors can fix easily. The kind that lives in your mind and makes you forget who you are." Grace's eyes were wide and serious. Samuel watched them in the mirror, these two broken people finding each other in the space between words. At the foundation, Margaret got out of the car and stood staring at the concrete. Then she turned back and opened Grace's door. "Would you like to see?" Grace looked at Samuel. He nodded. She climbed out and took Margaret's hand. Samuel watched them walk to the edge of the foundation. Margaret knelt beside Grace and pointed at the empty space, explaining something Samuel couldn't hear. Grace listened, her small hand still in Margaret's, and for a moment they looked like what they were, two people trying to make sense of absence. When they returned to the car, Grace was holding a small stone she'd picked up from the site. Margaret's eyes were red, but her face looked softer, less frozen. At the bank, Margaret asked Grace if she wanted to come inside. Grace shook her head, but watched through the window as Margaret entered the building. When Margaret returned, she was carrying a small bag. "For you," Margaret said, handing it to Grace. Inside was a sketchbook, real artist paper, the expensive kind, and a set of colored pencils that gleamed like jewels. Grace's mouth opened. She looked at the sketchbook, then at Margaret, then at Samuel. Her eyes were full of questions she didn't have words for. "For all those houses you draw," Margaret said softly, "maybe you can help me imagine one that actually gets built." Grace clutched the sketchbook to her chest. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," though no sound came out. It was enough. The days that followed felt different. Grace came with them every morning, and the car slowly filled with something that resembled peace. Margaret talked more, mostly to Grace, telling her stories about Michael. Grace listened and drew, and sometimes she showed Margaret her pictures. Margaret always studied them carefully, taking them seriously in a way that made Grace sit straighter. Samuel watched this connection form and felt something like hope, but he also felt the weight of what he didn't know about Margaret's company, about the life she led outside these 4 locations. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in early November. Samuel was reading the newspaper while Grace ate breakfast. A headline caught his eye. "Whitmore Development Corp. Faces backlash over Riverside evictions." He read the article twice, his stomach sinking with each word. Whitmore Development was evicting 200 families from low-income housing to build luxury condos. Residents were protesting. City Council was divided. The project was moving forward anyway. Samuel's mind raced. Riverside. That was where Laura had died, where their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had watched Grace when Laura was in hospice, where the community had brought them meals and helped with bills when Samuel couldn't work. The company destroying that neighborhood belonged to Margaret. He picked up Grace and drove to the mansion in silence. When Margaret entered the car, she noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. Samuel pulled out of the driveway. His hands were tight on the wheel, jaw clenched. He drove to the hospital and parked, but instead of waiting in silence, he turned to face her. "Riverside," he said. "The evictions. That's your company." Margaret's face went carefully blank. "It's business. It's people's homes. Families. The woman who took care of Grace when my wife was dying lives there. She's going to lose everything." Margaret's voice turned cold, defensive. "I don't handle day-to-day operations. The board makes those decisions. But you could stop it. It's not that simple." It is exactly that simple. The air in the car was electric, charged with 3 years of grief and rage that Samuel had kept locked away. Grace sat frozen in the front seat, her eyes wide. Samuel's voice broke. "You talk about failing your son, about wishing you'd done more. And then you do this. You destroy the only thing some people have." Margaret's composure cracked. Her hands started shaking. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." "I can't." Her voice rose. I can't explain any of it. I can't explain how I built an empire and couldn't save my own child. I can't explain how I turned into this person I don't recognize. I can't explain how I wake up every day and go through the motions and feel absolutely nothing except when I'm sitting in that parking lot or standing at that foundation or... She stopped. Her breathing was ragged. Tears were streaming down her face now, the mask, finally, fully shattered. Or when Grace is in this car, Margaret finished quietly. She's the only thing that's made me feel human in 2 years. And now you're telling me I'm destroying the people who helped keep her alive. The truth of it hung in the air between them. Samuel felt his anger deflate, replaced by something more complicated. Margaret wasn't a villain. She was a person who'd forgotten how to be a person, who'd let grief turn her into stone. Grace climbed out of her seat. She squeezed between the front seats and stood next to Margaret in the back. Then she did something she hadn't done for anyone except Samuel in 3 years. She hugged Margaret. Margaret broke. She wrapped her arms around Grace and sobbed into the girl's hair, her whole body shaking. Samuel watched his daughter hold this broken woman, offering comfort in the only way she knew how, through silence and presence and the simple act of not letting go. When Margaret finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and raw. She looked at Samuel with eyes that had been hiding behind ice for so long, they'd forgotten what warmth felt like. "I don't know how to fix it," Margaret whispered. "I don't know how to fix any of it." Samuel met her gaze. "Start with one thing. Start with Riverside." Margaret nodded slowly. Then she looked at Grace, touched the girl's cheek gently. "Would you help me?" Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the sketchbook Margaret had given her. She opened it to a page where she'd drawn a house. Not empty this time. This one had windows full of light, flowers in the yard, people standing in the doorway. Margaret stared at the drawing. Her lips trembled. A home. Grace nodded. Samuel drove them back to the mansion in silence, but when they arrived, Margaret didn't get out immediately. She sat there holding Grace's drawing, studying it like a map to somewhere she'd forgotten existed. "I need to make some calls," Margaret said finally. "Arthur will bring you both inside." She took the drawing with her into the house. Samuel and Grace waited in the foyer while Arthur brought them tea. Grace sat swinging her legs, humming a tuneless song, the first sound she'd made in months that resembled joy. Hours passed. Late afternoon became evening. Arthur brought sandwiches. Grace curled up on a velvet couch and fell asleep. Samuel sat watching the hallway where Margaret had disappeared, wondering what was happening behind those closed doors. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Margaret finally emerged. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hair had come loose from its usual severe style. She looked exhausted and electrified at the same time. "I called an emergency board meeting," Margaret said. "Tomorrow morning. I'm proposing we cancel the Riverside project and convert the existing buildings into affordable housing instead. It'll cost the company millions. The board will fight me. I might lose." Samuel stood. "But you're trying." "I'm trying," Margaret agreed. She looked at Grace sleeping on the couch. She drew a house with people in it, with light. "I haven't thought about light in 2 years." She walked to the couch and gently brushed hair from Grace's face. The gesture was tender, almost maternal. Grace stirred but didn't wake. "Michael was 23 when he died," Margaret said. "The last thing he said to me was that I'd turned into a machine, that I'd forgotten how to see people as anything other than numbers and obstacles. He said I'd lost my humanity building an empire, and that's why I couldn't understand, why he needed drugs just to feel alive." Her voice broke on the last words. "He was right," Margaret continued. "I did lose it. I forgot what mattered, and by the time I remembered, he was gone. I've been punishing myself ever since, going to those 4 places every day like some kind of penance. But it wasn't penance. It was hiding. I was hiding from having to actually change." Samuel moved to stand beside her. You're not hiding anymore." Margaret looked up at him. In the dim light of the foyer, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Human. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "What if I can't do it? What if I lose everything trying to fix one thing?" "Then you lose it," Samuel said. "But at least you'll be able to look at yourself again." Margaret's laugh was small and broken. "Michael would have liked you. He would have liked Grace. I think I would have liked him too." They stood there in silence, two people who'd lost everything, learning how to hold something fragile and new. The possibility that grief didn't have to be the end of the story. Grace woke up as Samuel was carrying her to the car. She blinked sleepily, then reached out toward Margaret. "Stay," Grace whispered. It was the first word she'd spoken aloud in front of Margaret. The first word she'd spoken to anyone outside of Samuel in nearly 3 years. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She took Grace's small hand and held it. "I'll see you tomorrow," Margaret promised. "After the meeting. We'll go to all 4 places. And then, we'll come back here and figure out what happens next. All 3 of us." Grace nodded and laid her head on Samuel's shoulder. As Samuel drove away from the mansion, he watched Margaret in the rearview mirror. She stood in the doorway with Arthur beside her, one hand raised in farewell. She looked smaller than usual, more fragile, but she also looked more real than she had in the 2 months he'd known her. That night, Grace slept in her own bed for the first time in weeks. She'd been sleeping in Samuel's room since Laura died, afraid to be alone. But tonight, she'd asked to sleep in her own space. Samuel tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "You did a good thing today," he told her, "helping Margaret." Grace looked up at him with Laura's eyes. "She's sad like us." "Yeah, she is. But maybe we don't have to be sad forever." Samuel's throat tightened. He touched his daughter's cheek. This wise, small person who'd somehow held on to hope when he'd nearly lost it entirely. "Maybe we don't," he agreed. He left Grace's door cracked open and walked to his own room. The newspaper article about Riverside was still on his kitchen table. He read it again, thinking about Mrs. Patterson and all the other families waiting to see if they'd lose their homes. Tomorrow, Margaret would walk into that boardroom and face the empire she'd built. She'd try to dismantle part of it to save something more important. She might fail, probably would fail, but she was trying. And in the space between where they'd been and where they were going, something impossible was taking shape. Something that looked like healing, like family. Like light returning to windows that had been dark too long. Samuel turned off the light and climbed into bed. For the first time in 3 years, he fell asleep without dreaming of Laura's final moments. Instead, he dreamed of Grace laughing, of Margaret smiling, of a house filled with people who'd been broken and had learned to fit their pieces back together in new and unexpected ways. Samuel didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about Margaret walking into that boardroom, facing executives who saw only profit margins and quarterly reports. People who wouldn't understand why their CEO suddenly wanted to throw away millions on a neighborhood full of strangers. Grace woke him at dawn, already dressed and holding her sketchbook. "We need to go," she said. Samuel blinked at his daughter standing in his doorway, speaking in full sentences, like she'd never stopped. Like the past 3 years had been a dream they were both waking from. "The meeting isn't until 9, Samuel said. "We don't pick her up until after." Grace shook her head. "She needs us there." Samuel didn't argue. He got dressed and made breakfast while Grace sat at the table drawing. When he looked over her shoulder, he saw she'd sketched Margaret standing in front of a long table, surrounded by shadowy figures. But in Grace's drawing, Margaret wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures stood beside her. They arrived at the mansion at 7:30. Arthur opened the door before Samuel could knock. "She's been up all night," Arthur said quietly. "In the study. She won't eat." Samuel and Grace followed him through the hallways. The study door was open. Margaret sat at her desk, surrounded by papers and reports, her laptop glowing in the dim room. She looked up when they entered, surprise crossing her exhausted face. "What are you doing here?" Grace walked to the desk and placed her drawing in front of Margaret, the one with the 3 figures. Margaret stared at it. Her hand moved to her mouth. "You think I need backup?" "We know you do," Samuel said. Margaret looked between them, this strange makeshift family that had formed in the space of a few months. Her eyes were wet. "I can't bring you into the boardroom. It's not—" "We'll wait outside," Samuel said. "But we'll be there." Margaret stood slowly. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, wrinkled now, her hair coming loose. She looked nothing like the Ice Queen who'd hired him 2 months ago. She looked human and terrified and determined. "I might lose everything," Margaret said. "We've all lost everything already," Samuel replied. "That's why we're still here." The drive to Whitmore Development headquarters was silent. Grace sat in front holding Margaret's hand through the gap between the seats. Margaret stared out the window, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled. The building was glass and steel, climbing 30 floors into the gray morning sky. Samuel parked in the executive garage. Margaret didn't move immediately. She sat gripping Grace's hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. "Michael came here once," Margaret said. "He was 19. High and angry and shouting in the lobby about what a hypocrite I was, building homes for rich people while ignoring everyone else. Security escorted him out. I had them ban him from the property." Her voice cracked. "I chose this building over my son. I chose all of it over him. And now I'm going to walk in there and tell them it was all wrong." Grace squeezed her hand. "Houses with light," the girl whispered. Margaret looked at her. Then she nodded and opened the door. Samuel and Grace followed her through the lobby and into a private elevator. They rode to the 28th floor in silence. The hallway was all polished wood and expensive art. Margaret's heels clicked against the floor like a countdown. She stopped outside the boardroom doors. Through the glass, Samuel could see 12 people already seated around a massive table. They looked impatient, checking watches and phones. "Wait here," Margaret said. She looked at Samuel, really looked at him. "Thank you. For the job nobody wanted. For not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself." Samuel touched her shoulder. "Go save Riverside." Margaret straightened her jacket, lifted her chin, and walked through the doors. Samuel and Grace sat on a bench across from the boardroom. Through the glass wall, they could see Margaret take her seat at the head of the table, could see her begin to speak, couldn't hear the words, but could read the reaction in the board members' faces, confusion, then anger, then shock. Grace drew in her sketchbook. Samuel watched the scene unfold like a silent film. Margaret stood. She was gesturing now, her voice rising enough that muffled sound reached the hallway. A man in a gray suit slammed his hand on the table. A woman shook her head, gathering her papers. Margaret kept talking. She pulled out documents, slid them across the table. Pointed at numbers, at projections, at something Samuel couldn't see but hoped was Grace's drawing of the house with light. An hour passed, then 2. Board members stood and sat and argued and checked their phones. Margaret never sat down. She stood at the head of that table like someone fighting for her life, because, in a way, she was. Fighting for the right to be human again, to make choices that mattered more than money. Grace leaned against Samuel's side. "She's winning. How can you tell? They're listening. They stopped yelling." Samuel looked through the glass. Grace was right. The board members were leaning forward now, reading the documents Margaret had distributed, asking questions instead of shouting. One older man was nodding slowly. At 3 hours, the doors opened. Margaret emerged with Arthur, who'd appeared at some point during the meeting. Her face was unreadable. She walked to where Samuel and Grace waited. and Samuel's heart was pounding because he couldn't tell if she'd won or lost everything. Margaret knelt in front of Grace. They approved it. The Riverside project is canceled. We're converting the buildings to affordable housing, creating a rehabilitation fund for families who need it, and I'm establishing the Michael Whitmore Foundation to support addiction recovery and family services. Grace threw her arms around Margaret's neck. Margaret held her tight, and Samuel saw Arthur turn away, wiping his eyes. "There are conditions," Margaret continued, pulling back to look at Grace. "The board wants oversight. They're watching every move. If this fails, if the numbers don't work, I'll lose my position. But right now, in this moment, 200 families get to keep their homes." Samuel felt something break open in his chest, relief and pride, and something bigger than both. "You did it." Margaret stood, still holding Grace's hand. "We did it. You showed me what I'd become. Grace showed me what mattered. I just had to be brave enough to act." She looked at Arthur. The old butler smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had ever seen on his face. "Master Michael would be proud," Arthur said softly. Margaret's composure wavered. She nodded, unable to speak. They drove back to the mansion in a car that felt lighter, as if the weight of grief had finally loosened its grip. Grace sat in back with Margaret, showing her drawings from the sketchbook. Margaret studied each one carefully, asking questions, pointing out details. They looked like mother and daughter. Like family. At the mansion, Arthur had prepared lunch. They ate in the conservatory, a glass room full of plants that Samuel had never seen before. Sunlight poured through the windows. Grace ate with her fingers, something she hadn't done since Laura got sick. Margaret laughed at something Grace said, and the sound was startling and beautiful. After lunch, Margaret led them to a room on the second floor that Samuel hadn't known existed. It was large and bright, filled with tables and art supplies, and windows that overlooked the garden. "This was Michael's studio," Margaret explained. "He worked here when he was in high school, before everything fell apart. I locked it after he died, couldn't bear to look at it." The room was exactly as he'd left it, sketches pinned to walls, half-finished architectural models on tables. Books about sustainable design and community planning. Samuel could see Michael in every detail, a young man who'd wanted to build things that mattered, who'd been crushed under the weight of his mother's empire and his own demons. Margaret walked to a shelf and pulled down a box. Inside were dozens of drawings. She spread them across a table. "He designed affordable housing," Margaret said. "Sustainable. Beautiful. Accessible. Everything I should have been building. Everything I ignored because it didn't generate enough profit." Grace stood on her toes to see the drawings. Her eyes went wide. "These are beautiful." Margaret looked at the sketches with fresh eyes, seeing them the way Grace did. "They are, aren't they?" She turned to Samuel. "I want to use these, for Riverside, for other projects. I want to build what Michael imagined. Make his designs real." Samuel picked up one of the drawings. It showed a community of small houses arranged around a central garden, affordable but dignified, practical but full of light. Exactly what Grace had drawn in her sketchbook. "He'd love that," Samuel said. Margaret's smile was sad and hopeful at once. "I think he would." Over the following weeks, the mansion transformed. Margaret hired architects and engineers who specialized in affordable housing. She brought in community organizers from Riverside to consult on the redesign. She turned the dining room into a planning center, the walls covered with blueprints and budgets and timelines. Samuel's role expanded beyond driving. He became a liaison to the Riverside community, someone they trusted because he'd lived there, because he understood their fear and skepticism. He brought Mrs. Patterson to meet Margaret. The old woman who'd cared for Grace during Laura's final days sat in the conservatory, drinking tea with a billionaire, discussing playgrounds and community gardens. Grace started attending a new school, one Margaret helped Samuel afford. But every afternoon, she came to the mansion and worked in Michael's studio. She drew and painted while Margaret worked on plans for the foundation. Sometimes other children came, kids from Riverside, whose families were part of the redesign process. The mansion filled with noise and life, and the sound of children laughing in rooms that had been silent for too long. Arthur smiled more. He started teaching Grace how to make pastries in the kitchen. She'd stand on a stool beside him, flour on her nose, chattering about her day at school. Samuel would watch from the doorway and feel his heart expand with something he'd forgotten existed. Joy. One evening in early December, Margaret called Samuel and Grace to the conservatory. The room was warm despite the cold outside, candlelit and intimate. Arthur had prepared dinner, and the four of them sat around a small table like a family. "I have something to show you," Margaret said after they'd eaten. She led them back to Michael's studio. On the main table sat a large architectural model, a community of small houses arranged around a central green space, gardens and playgrounds, a community center, all of it designed with care and beauty and dignity. "Riverside," Margaret said. "Using Michael's designs, we break ground in the spring." Grace circled the model, studying every detail. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small ceramic bowl. It was broken, cracks running through it, but the cracks had been filled with gold. "I made this," Grace said, "in art class. It's called kintsugi. You fix broken things with gold so the cracks become beautiful." She placed it beside the model. "Like us. Like the houses." Margaret stared at the bowl, at the gold running through the breaks, at this child who understood metaphor and healing in ways that took adults years to grasp. "Like us," Margaret agreed. She walked to a cabinet and pulled out 3 more broken pieces, a vase, a plate, a cup. Michael broke these when he was angry. I kept them hidden because I didn't know what to do with broken things. I thought broken meant worthless. She set them on the table beside Grace's bowl. "Will you teach me? How to fix them?" Grace nodded. "We can fix them together." Over the following weeks, the studio became a place of repair. Grace taught Margaret the Japanese art of kintsugi, how to mix the lacquer, how to apply the gold. They worked slowly, carefully, turning broken pottery into something more beautiful than it had been whole. Other children joined them, kids from Riverside and from Grace's school. They brought broken things from home, dishes and figurines and toys, and learned to make the damage visible, to honor it instead of hiding it. Samuel watched his daughter become a teacher, watched Margaret become a student, watched them build something together that had nothing to do with money or business and everything to do with transformation. In January, the foundation officially launched. Margaret held a small ceremony at the mansion, inviting families from Riverside and representatives from addiction recovery programs. Grace gave a speech she'd written herself about how broken things could be beautiful. Her voice was clear and strong, nothing like the silent child she'd been 6 months ago. Mrs. Patterson hugged Samuel afterward, tears on her lined face. "Laura would be so proud," she whispered, "of Grace, of you, of what you've built here." Samuel looked across the room where Grace and Margaret stood together, examining a newly repaired vase. 2 people who'd been drowning in grief learning to breathe again. "I didn't build it," Samuel said. "We found each other, and we decided not to stay broken." That night, after the guests had left, and Grace had fallen asleep on the conservatory couch, Samuel and Margaret stood in the garden. It was cold, stars bright overhead. The mansion glowed behind them, no longer a monument to silence, but a home full of light. The job nobody wanted, Margaret said softly. Why did you take it? Samuel thought about that morning months ago, standing in the rain with nothing left to lose. Because I was desperate, and because sometimes desperation looks like fate. Margaret turned to face him. I'm glad you called. I'm glad you didn't give up when I was impossible. I'm glad Grace made me remember what it felt like to be human. She has that effect on people. Margaret smiled. So do you. They stood there in the cold garden, two people who'd survived grief and found each other on the other side, not fixed, not whole, but healing, together. Inside, Arthur was carrying Grace to the car. Samuel and Margaret walked back toward the light, toward the sound of Arthur's gentle voice and Grace's sleepy murmur, toward a future neither of them had imagined when this started. The mansion wasn't a place of mourning anymore. It was where healing happened, where broken things became beautiful, where a job nobody wanted became the best decision of Samuel Carter's life.